Cultural deterioration. When women begin to regress spiritually and morally, we should expect cultural deterioration to accelerate. Here's Gene to explain.
Now, as you look through the whole biblical story, you will see that ever since sin entered into the world, men generally, the male species, men generally have led the way in violating God's moral and spiritual values. And generally speaking, women have been a deterrent, holding back in some respects to moral deterioration, even though they have the same sin nature. But what happens when women begin to deteriorate morally? It speeds up the whole process and going down, down, down into degeneration. When women begin to lead the way in terms of immorality. And you can see that all around us. We're in that process, I think, within our own society. And Amos speaks to this issue. In Amos chapter 4, verse 1, he says, "Listen to this message, you cows of Bashan." Don't be offended by that. That's a compliment in that culture. You may not think it's complimentary to be called a cow. But a cow of Bashan was an animal to be admired. Listen to this message, you cows of Bashan, who are on the hills of Samaria. See, he's using a metaphor. Women, and here he spells out who he's talking about. Women who oppress the poor and crush the needy, who say to their husbands, "Bring us something to drink." And it doesn't take much imagination to know who's in control in this situation. Women have begun within Israel to deteriorate to the same level as men as they were deteriorating. We have illustrations of this in the Bible. For example, Jezebel stands out as an incredible example and illustration of leading Israel deep into sin. Ahab, who was a king of Israel, married Jezebel, who was a pagan. And he began to follow her lead in the worship of Baal and the Asherahs. And it's just horrible. And even Jesus Christ in the book of Revelation uses Jezebel as a metaphor to illustrate ultimate deterioration in the church. She has become a symbol of immorality and deterioration, an impact that a woman in immorality can have on her husband and, in this case, the whole nation of Israel. A negative influence, and it impacted the whole nation. And you know, it's interesting that if you look at the book of Romans, you go to chapter 1, you look at what the Apostle Paul wrote. When he addressed progressive moral and spiritual deterioration, the deterioration began with heterosexual sin, Romans 1:24. Therefore, God delivered them over in the cravings of their hearts to sexual impurity so that their bodies were degraded among themselves. And in context, I believe he's referring here to heterosexual immorality and deterioration, which, by the way, certainly is a reflection of our culture today. On television, in the movies, on cable, on the internet, just a deterioration. It's absolutely incredible what is being viewed today by the American public, and unfortunately by young people and even children. It's a tragedy. But there's another level down, and it's homosexual sin. In Romans 1:26, this is why God delivered them over to degrading passions. All immorality is degrading, but degrading passions here are associated with immorality, homosexual immorality. And here it says, for even their females. And that, I think, is significant. It's one thing for men to degrade. It's another thing for females to degrade and go downhill. And so Paul addresses this issue. For even their females exchange natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In other words, here you have the deterioration that really even that Amos was referring to and other prophets in the Old Testament. So this leads to a very practical question, and that is, What specific steps can spiritual leaders take to counter moral and spiritual deterioration among all men and women who claim to be followers of Jesus Christ? And we might also say, even within our culture, among those who don't even know Jesus Christ. Well, first of all, as spiritual leaders, we must not compromise on in our own teaching regarding what the Scriptures teach. And today, in our culture and society, there's incredible compromise. It began with condoning heterosexual sin, immorality, sex out of wedlock, couples living together, and apart from marriage, apart from a committed relationship. And so the church today, in many instances, condones that as a viable lifestyle, even for Christians. Not according to the Scriptures. Not according to the Scriptures. There's no way that you can make the Scriptures teach that. And yet we can twist the Scriptures to accept that cultural deviation from the Word of God. The other issue is homosexuality. And it's splitting churches. It's destroying churches. And there are pastors that will not speak out against it. By the way, I think we have to face the fact that even in our own culture, it's going to become difficult to speak out against it. And there are some people who actually read the Bible, could eventually go to jail, as they have in some other cultures, by simply reading Romans chapter 1 publicly, which is a violation of rights. And so it's going to be interesting to see what happens in our own culture. But we cannot compromise the Word of God. If we do, people are going to continue to move in the wrong direction. It takes the Word of God, not the Word of man, but the Word of God. And as I said, it splits churches. I just had an experience recently where I was sitting on an airplane and a man sat down next to me, and it just so happened that I'd been preaching in a church, and he said, "I heard you preach today." And I was totally surprised, but I considered it a divine appointment. And he went on to explain that he had just left a church with he and his wife because the whole church had split over the whole issue of homosexuality. And he said one of the mistakes the pastor made was to go to the congregation and say, "Can we accept this as a lifestyle?" 50% of them said, "Yes, we can accept it." 50% of them said no, and it split the church. You can't ask the congregation to lead the church. As spiritual leaders, we've got to lead the church. We've got to lay out what God says. That is the responsibility of those of us who are spiritual leaders and shepherds. And we must not compromise in that area. If we do, we're in violation of a very significant principle that should guide us and direct us in our lives.